before Egypt raised its pyramids, before the Greeks gave us philosophy, before the Romans built their empire, there was Sumer, a civilization so ancient, so groundbreaking, that most people today have never even heard of it. And yet, almost everything we associate with civilization was born in their hands. Writing, cities, laws, irrigation, astronomy, timekeeping, and even myth itself. These were not the inventions of a slow crawl through centuries. They were the gifts of one people, living between two rivers in a land we now call Iraq over 5,000 years ago. The Sumerians did not leave behind flashy monuments or colossal tombs carved in stone. They left something far more powerful, a blueprint for human society. But who were they? Where did they come from, and how did they know what no one else did? How could a civilization emerge from the mudflats of Mesopotamia and give rise to the very foundations of human culture? What gods did they worship? What stories did they whisper under starlit skies? And why, after achieving so much, did they vanish into history, leaving behind questions that still puzzle the world's greatest minds? This is not just a story of ancient bricks and broken tablets. It's a story of dreams. The Sumerians dreamed up the idea of cities, built the first schools, composed the first hymns, and recorded the first laws. They asked questions about life and death, about gods and kings, about the afterlife and immortality, questions we still ask today. Their myths echo in our religions, their symbols in our alphabets, their stories in our literature, and yet they are rarely taught, rarely remembered, as if their genius was too old to matter. But make no mistake, the story of Sumer is the story of us. Without the Sumerians, civilization as we know it might not exist. This video will take you on a journey from the dawn of writing to the edge of legend, from ziggurats that kissed the heavens to clay tablets etched with prophecy and power. We'll explore every invention, every deity, every war and wonder. Nothing will be skipped, nothing will be forgotten, because before anything else, before history itself, there were the Sumerians. The story of the Sumerians begins in mystery. Unlike other ancient civilizations whose ancestral roots stretch back in clear, traceable lines, the origins of the Sumerians remain an enigma. They did not rise slowly from local Neolithic cultures, but appeared suddenly, astonishingly, in southern Mesopotamia around 4,500 BCE, already equipped with a complex language, agricultural expertise, and a capacity for building organized urban centers. No one knows for certain where they came from. Their language, Sumerian, is a linguistic isolate, a tongue that cannot be linked to any other language on Earth. It resembles nothing that came before or after. It stands alone like a voice from a vanished world. Some scholars have theorized that the Sumerians may have migrated from the east, perhaps from the Iranian plateau or the Indus Valley, drawn by the Fertile Crescent's promise of water and arable land. Others propose origins from the north, linking them to ancient cultures in the Caucasus, or even further afield. And there are more unconventional ideas still, whispers of a sea people or lost homeland beyond the reach of archaeology. But none of these theories fully satisfy the puzzle. What we do know is that their arrival marked a radical shift in the region's development. They brought with them not just knowledge, but culture, a new way of organizing life, of measuring time, of recording reality in symbols and story. Their earliest settlements clustered in the lower reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a marshy, flood-prone landscape that would have discouraged most migrants. But the Sumerians saw opportunity. They transformed the land through an intricate network of canals and irrigation ditches, turning swamps into farmland and barren clay into bread. Here, cities like Eridu, Ur, and Uruk were born, not just clusters of huts, but full urban systems, complete with administrative centers, temples, marketplaces, and social hierarchies. Eridu, often called the first city in the world, was said to have been founded by the gods themselves. In Sumerian mythology, it was the seat of Enki, god of wisdom and freshwater, who taught humans how to survive and thrive. The leap from rural village life to advanced urban civilization happened faster than expected, and with it came innovations that seemed to spring from nowhere. Writing, monumental architecture, centralized government. The Sumerians did not evolve in isolation, but they also didn't copy. Instead, they seemed to emerge already imagining the future, laying out the architecture of civilization with stunning speed and clarity. This sudden explosion of knowledge and order remains one of the great mysteries in human history. Archaeological digs have uncovered thousands of clay tablets from these early cities, many etched in cuneiform, the earliest form of writing. But these tablets do not tell us where the Sumerians came from. Instead, they describe laws, trade agreements, hymns, and dreams. They describe a people who were already fully immersed in their own cosmic worldview, already speaking of gods and destinies, already charting the skies and recording the names of kings. We are left to piece together their prehistory from pottery styles, settlement patterns, and genetic clues. But the essence of who they were before they became Sumerian remains just out of reach, and perhaps that is fitting. The Sumerians did not begin as a slow whisper of culture. They arrived as a full voice, confident, articulate, and visionary. Like the first stroke of ink on a blank page, their presence marked the true beginning of human history. And though we may never know the land that birthed them, the world they built would echo forever. In their sudden appearance lies one of the most haunting and captivating questions in archaeology. Not just how they rose, but what ancient dream they carried with them into the rivers of Mesopotamia. As the Sumerians settled along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, their ingenuity transformed them from scattered agrarian communities into the architects of the first true civilization. What emerged was not a unified empire, but a constellation of powerful, independent city-states, each with its own ruler, deity, and identity, all thriving within the shared cultural fabric of Sumer. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu became the beating hearts of Mesopotamia, not only as centers of commerce and religion, but as living experiments in how to build and sustain complex human societies. Uruk, the largest and perhaps most influential of these early cities, stood like a beacon of innovation around 4000 BCE. Its towering ziggurat, whitewashed and sun-baked, rose above the plains as both a spiritual axis and a symbol of civic pride. The city sprawled with tens of thousands of people, unprecedented for its time, protected by massive walls said to have been built by the legendary king Gilgamesh. Within these walls, life was organized, deliberate, and advanced. Uruk was a pioneer in urban planning, featuring wide avenues, marketplaces, temple complexes, and specialized districts. This wasn't just a cluster of dwellings. It was a city in the truest sense, a planned, breathing organism designed for human life and divine reverence. Just to the south, Eridu was considered the oldest city, a sacred place believed to be the first creation of the gods. It was here that the god Enki was said to have lived, and where some of the earliest temples were built layer upon layer over centuries. Eridu, while smaller than Uruk, held immense spiritual significance, a kind of cultural memory of where order had begun. Ur, further downstream, would later rise as a powerful economic and religious hub, famous for its royal tombs and wealth, linking trade routes that stretched as far as the Indus Valley. Each city was politically autonomous, often at odds with its neighbors, yet united through shared language, religious beliefs, and administrative innovations. The governments of these city-states evolved from priestly councils to kingship. At first, temple priests governed in the name of the gods, organizing agricultural labor, storing grain, and distributing resources. The temple, or Egal, big house, was the economic and administrative center, reflecting the Sumerian view that society was an extension of divine order. Over time, as conflicts grew more frequent and the need for military leadership increased, secular rulers, Lugal, meaning big man, emerged. These kings were seen as chosen by the gods, though not divine themselves. They were caretakers of divine will, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance between chaos and order. The Sumerian economy was driven by agriculture, enabled by one of the most sophisticated irrigation systems of the ancient world. Water from the rivers was channeled into canals and reservoirs, feeding fields of barley, dates, flax, and legumes. Surplus grain became currency, traded locally and abroad. Sumerian cities became bustling trade centers, dealing in copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Markets thrived, craftsmen specialized, and scribes recorded every transaction in cuneiform, the earliest form of written accounting. Society in Sumer was highly stratified. At the top stood the king and his priestly entourage, followed by landowners, merchants, and skilled artisans. Below them were laborers and farmers, and at the bottom, slaves, often prisoners of war or those indebted to others. This social structure was rigid but functional, upheld by religious belief and economic necessity. The temple economy ensured that food was distributed, rituals were performed, and justice was administered. Yet it was not without tension. City-states clashed over resources and prestige, and internal strife was not uncommon. Despite this hierarchy, the Sumerians created opportunities for cultural expression across classes. Schools trained scribes in mathematics, law, and literature. Temples employed musicians, dancers, and cooks for elaborate religious festivals. Women, while largely excluded from politics, could own property, run businesses, and serve as priestesses. Laws were recorded on tablets for public knowledge, an early expression of legal accountability and civic order. This was a society that not only survived, it flourished with complexity and nuance. The rise of the Sumerian city-states represents one of the greatest turning points in human history. Here in the lowland plains of Mesopotamia, the foundations of modern urban life were laid, from governance and law to trade and culture. These cities were not just centers of power, they were incubators of thought, hubs of myth, and mirrors of humanity's ambition. Their legacy is not only in ruins and relics, but in the very way we still structure our societies today. When we speak of the Sumerians as the first civilization, it is not an exaggeration. It is a simple fact built on the astonishing range of inventions they gifted to the world. Tools and systems so foundational that they continue to shape our daily lives millennia later. The Sumerians were not just survivors or settlers, they were inventors. And what they invented changed everything. The most revolutionary of their contributions was cuneiform, the world's first system of writing. It began not with poetry, but with counting. Small clay tokens representing livestock and grain were eventually replaced by markings pressed into wet clay tablets using a reed stylus. These markings evolved into abstract symbols, wedge-shaped impressions that formed the backbone of the Sumerian script. What started as accounting records quickly expanded into a written language capable of capturing law, myth, literature, and even dreams. Cuneiform made history itself possible. For the first time, human memory was no longer confined to breath and voice. It could be stored, copied, and passed down across generations. Just as profound was the invention of the wheel, not initially for transportation, but for pottery. The potter's wheel, developed around 3500 BCE, was a breakthrough in craft, allowing for the production of symmetrical, high-quality vessels. This innovation soon inspired the creation of wheeled carts and chariots, revolutionizing agriculture, warfare, and trade. The wheel is now so embedded in our technological DNA that we rarely question its origin. But it began in the dusty workshops of ancient Sumer, turning silently, shaping the future. Mathematics, too, was born under the Sumerian sky. Using a sexagesimal system based on the number 60, they developed a numerical method that still influences our clocks and geometry today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. These time divisions trace back to Sumer. They used base 60 math for practical tasks, calculating harvest yields, measuring land, tracking temple donations. Over time, they developed multiplication tables, division exercises, and even quadratic equations recorded in clay for young scribes to study. To manage the cycles of agriculture and the will of the gods, the Sumerians created one of the earliest calendars, rooted in the movements of the moon and stars. Their calendar was lunar, consisting of 12 months, each corresponding to a particular phase of the moon. This structure allowed them to plan religious festivals, coordinate planting and harvesting, and record historical events. Time itself became structured, a rhythm of cosmic and human cycles written into the order of the year. None of this would have been possible without their mastery of irrigation. In a land with unpredictable rainfall and flooding, survival depended on controlling water. The Sumerians engineered canals, levees, reservoirs, and dikes to bring river water to their fields. This network of irrigation wasn't just practical, it was political. Whoever controlled water controlled power. The management of canals required labor, organization, and oversight, leading directly to the development of bureaucracy and civic administration. It was agriculture powered by knowledge, not just muscle. A system that turned arid plains into thriving cities. And with complexity came conflict, disputes over land, trade, and inheritance. To keep order, the Sumerians introduced legal codes, some of the earliest known to humanity. Long before Hammurabi, the kings of Sumer were recording laws on clay tablets, edicts about property, contracts, marriage, theft, and slavery. These laws were not arbitrary, but grounded in a vision of cosmic balance. Justice, like water and worship, had to flow correctly, or chaos would return. In these codes, we glimpse the beginnings of civil society, not ruled by brute force, but by written law. Each of these inventions, writing, wheels, numbers, time, agriculture, and law, form the skeleton of civilization, and every one of them first emerged in Sumer. To imagine a world without them is to imagine a world unrecognizable, one without structure, without memory, without cities or stories or science. The Sumerians did not just survive their environment, they transcended it, building tools not only to shape the land, but to shape the future. Their minds were clay shapers, wheel turners, and word carvers, and through their hands, the human story began to accelerate. In the world of the Sumerians, there was no such thing as an inanimate object. Every rock, breeze, star, and shadow pulsed with spirit. Their universe was alive, teeming with beings seen and unseen, and at the center of it all stood the gods. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, intricate, and deeply woven into the structure of daily life. Their gods were not distant, abstract forces. They were immediate presences who watched over cities, punished injustice, rewarded devotion, and shaped the destiny of both empires and individuals. At the highest level of divine hierarchy was An, the god of the heavens, a distant and often silent force who represented the infinite sky and the ultimate source of authority. But An rarely acted directly. Instead, his power flowed through a more active god, Enlil, the lord of air, wind, and storms. Enlil was the true ruler of the divine world, the king of the gods. He decided the fate of humans and gods alike, and his moods dictated prosperity or ruin. He was both giver and destroyer, the force behind flourishing harvests and devastating floods. It was Enlil who, in many myths, granted kingship to cities and withdrew it when they fell out of favor. Then came Enki, Enlil's brother and the god of water, wisdom, magic, and creation. Enki was the trickster and the engineer, the problem solver of the divine realm. He lived in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean, and often acted as a protector of humanity, mediating between angry gods and fragile mortals. In creation myths, it was Enki who shaped humans out of clay to relieve the gods of their burdens. When the gods grew tired of working the land themselves, Enki devised a plan, using divine blood and river mud to craft the first people, giving them purpose, intelligence, and fate. But no deity captured the Sumerian imagination more vividly than Inanna, the goddess of love, war, fertility, and the morning star. Inanna was radiant and ruthless, a divine force of attraction and chaos. She presided over passion and power, over life and destruction. Her temples were filled with song, incense, and sacred rituals that blurred the lines between the sensual and the spiritual. Her most famous myth, her descent into the underworld, tells of how she challenged the realm of death, was stripped of her powers, killed, and resurrected. It is a story of courage, transformation, and cosmic balance, one that prefigures later myths from many other cultures. Inanna was not just adored. She was feared, revered, and invoked in both ecstasy and desperation. Each major Sumerian city had its patron deity, and the city's power was believed to rise and fall based on the favor of that god. In Uruk, it was Inanna. In Eridu, Enki. In Nippur, Enlil ruled from the grand temple of Ekur, the mountain house where heaven and earth met. These temples were not just religious buildings, they were the political and economic centers of city life. They housed scribes, stored grain, collected taxes, and orchestrated festivals. But towering above all stood the ziggurat, a massive terraced step structure meant to bridge the divine and the mortal. Each ziggurat was a cosmic axis, a ladder to the heavens. The most famous of these, the ziggurat of Ur, rose in stages toward the sky, with a temple at its summit where only priests could enter and commune with the god. Sumerian creation myths reflected their understanding of a universe governed by struggle and order. The cosmos, in their view, was born not in harmony, but through conflict. The primordial sea, chaotic and undivided, was split by divine action. Earth and sky were separated, time began, and the gods emerged in waves, each one responsible for a domain, a force, a mystery. Humanity was never the center of this story. Humans were created to serve, to maintain the temples, to honor the gods with food, music, and rituals. But this was not slavery, it was symbiosis. In return, the gods maintained cosmic balance, ensured seasonal cycles, and guarded the invisible threads that held reality together. Religion in Sumer was not a passive affair. The people actively participated in the cosmic order through daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and elaborate ceremonies. Priests interpreted omens in animal livers, astronomers charted divine patterns in the stars, and kings built temples to secure favor from the divine. Offerings of beer, bread, and incense were made regularly. Statues of gods were not symbolic. They were believed to house the actual presence of the deity, and were bathed, dressed, and fed like royalty. During festivals, the statues would even be paraded through the streets. reminding the people of the gods' living, watching presence. Sumerian spirituality was not just mythology, it was an entire worldview. It explained why rivers flooded and fields yielded fruit, why kings rose and cities fell. It was a religion of reciprocity, one where the fate of humans and gods were intertwined. The divine was not separate from the world. It permeated every breath of it, from temple steps to palace walls, from farmers tilling fields to scribes etching hymns in clay. The gods were everywhere, and in that sacred entanglement, the Sumerians found both awe and purpose, a sense that their lives were woven into a much larger cosmic design. Of all the legacies left by the Sumerians, perhaps none are as haunting, as immortal, or as profoundly human as their myths and epics. These were not simple fables or religious dogma. They were intricate, symbolic narratives crafted to explain the mysteries of existence. At the heart of Sumerian storytelling lies a deep emotional pulse, a raw and poetic meditation on life, death, fate, love, fear, and the search for meaning. The myths of Sumer shimmer with divine battles, sacred journeys, cosmic chaos, and fragile humanity. None more powerful than the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known epic in world literature. The story begins in Uruk, the city of towering walls and restless gods. Its king, Gilgamesh, is part divine and part human, gifted with immense strength and cursed with unrelenting arrogance. He rules with an iron hand, crushing the spirits of his people, until the gods intervene by creating Enkidu, a wild man born of clay, a mirror to humble the king. Their rivalry turns to deep friendship, and together they embark on heroic quests, slaying monsters like Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and killing the bull of heaven unleashed by the furious goddess Inanna. But the price of their glory is steep. The gods sentence Enkidu to death, and with his friends passing, Gilgamesh is shattered. It is here that the epic shifts from a tale of adventure to a haunting philosophical journey. Grief-stricken and terrified of his own mortality, Gilgamesh sets off in search of eternal life. He journeys through dark mountains, across cosmic seas, to meet Utnapishtim, a sage who survived the Great Flood, a clear forerunner of the later biblical Noah. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh a harsh truth, that immortality is reserved for the gods, and that even the mightiest must one day fall. In one final trial, Gilgamesh is offered a plant of renewal, a symbol of his hope, but it is stolen by a serpent while he sleeps. Empty-handed, he returns to Uruk, only to realize that the legacy of his deeds and the walls he built may be his only true immortality. The epic ends not with triumph, but with wisdom, a message that the search for meaning is more enduring than the illusion of eternal life. Beyond Gilgamesh, Sumerian mythology is filled with rich stories that explore the boundaries between mortal and divine. Tales of Inanna descending into the underworld to confront her sister Ereshkigal, goddess of the dead, tell of sacrifice, resurrection, and power dynamics among the gods. Inanna's journey is terrifying. She is stripped of her titles, her clothing, and finally her life, before returning changed. These myths were not just spiritual allegories, they were psychological truths, dramatizations of personal transformation, grief, renewal, and cosmic justice. The underworld in Sumerian myth was not a place of fire or punishment, but a cold and dusty realm where all souls went, regardless of virtue. Known as Kur, it was a land ruled by silence and shadows. The dead retained vague memories of life but lived without light or joy. It was not eternal torture, but it was bleak, a vision that made the pleasures and sorrows of mortal life all the more urgent and meaningful. Rituals and offerings to the dead were essential, not to bring them joy, but to ease their eternal hunger for remembrance. These myths and epics were more than stories told in temple courtyards or scribed into clay. They were cultural memory, a spiritual inheritance encoded in poetry, passed down by generations who knew that stories have the power to bind people together, to explain the inexplicable, and to confront the unbearable truths of human existence. In their epics, the Sumerians asked the same questions we still ask today. What happens when we die? How do we live with loss? Can we escape the fate that awaits us all? Though the language of the Sumerians has long since faded and their cities lie in ruins, the emotional resonance of their stories endures. Gilgamesh still walks through the ruins of Uruk in our collective memory, still seeking answers that lie just beyond reach. Their myths did not promise salvation, they offered understanding, a way to name the beauty and tragedy of being alive. Beneath the grandeur of temples and the glory of kings, real life in ancient Sumer unfolded in quiet, methodical rhythms. The rhythms of trade, labor, learning, and family. The daily life of the Sumerians, though anchored in a world so distant from ours, carries echoes that feel strikingly familiar. Their lives were shaped by the cycle of the sun, the pulse of the seasons, and the invisible hand of the gods. And while divine myths loomed large, so too did the practical realities of work, love, duty, and survival. Most Sumerians were farmers, tethered to the land and the rivers that made it fertile. They rose with the sun to tend fields of barley and wheat, to prune date palms, and to maintain the intricate irrigation canals that made the desert bloom. Their work was communal and seasonal, planting, harvesting, storing, and preparing for the next flood cycle. The farmer's calendar was sacred, its timing guided by priests and stars. Tools were made of bronze or stone, and plows were drawn by oxen. Every aspect of agricultural life was watched over by gods, and each offering of grain was a way to ensure continued blessing. In cities, life hummed with a different tempo. Sumerian jobs were highly specialized. There were potters, metalworkers, carpenters, jewelers, and scribes. Each craftsperson belonged to a guild-like structure and often passed their skills to children through apprenticeship. Markets were central to urban life, buzzing with traders offering fish, dates, textiles, oils, and incense. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade, navigating the rivers by boat or traversing deserts with donkeys loaded with goods. Sumerian cities were economic engines, alive with exchange, contracts, and enterprise. Food was simple but nourishing. Bread was the staple, baked in clay ovens or on open griddles. Beer, thick and cloudy, was safer than water and widely consumed, even by children. Meat from sheep, goats, or cattle was reserved for wealthier citizens or sacred occasions. Most meals consisted of stews flavored with garlic, onions, leeks, and herbs. At the family hearth, food was more than sustenance. It was an offering, a bond between generations, and a reminder of both divine generosity and mortal labor. The family was the core of Sumerian society. Households were multi-generational, with parents, children, and grandparents living under one roof, often in small mud-brick homes clustered along narrow alleyways. Fathers were the heads of households, but women held substantial influence within the home. Marriages were arranged, and contracts outlined the rights and responsibilities of both partners. Children were cherished, and boys, especially those from elite families, were educated in the Aduba, the tablet house or school, where they learned cuneiform, arithmetic, and the art of administration. Education in Sumer was rigorous and hierarchical. Only the sons of priests, officials, and scribes received formal schooling. These boys spent years memorizing and copying lists of signs, vocabulary, and proverbs. The profession of scribe was prestigious, offering access to government, temple, and commerce. Through writing, they became the memory keepers of their civilization. Teachers enforced discipline through corporal punishment, and school life was demanding. But to become a scribe was to enter the world of power and permanence. Law and justice were woven into daily life with remarkable clarity. Sumerian law codes etched into clay addressed everything from theft and adultery to contracts and debt. If a builder's house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder could be executed. If a son struck his father, his hand might be cut off. While harsh by modern standards, these laws reflected a desire for balance and accountability, an effort to bind a sprawling, stratified society together with fairness. Judges and witnesses played formal roles, and many disputes were settled with compensation rather than punishment. In gender roles, Sumerian society was patriarchal but not wholly restrictive. Women could own property, run businesses, act as priestesses, and even initiate divorce. Some were literate, and a few high-status women, like Enheduanna, daughter of King Sargon and the world's first known author, held spiritual and political power. While most women lived within domestic spheres, they were not without agency. The divine feminine, embodied by powerful goddesses like Inanna, reinforced the idea that women carried spiritual and societal value beyond reproduction. The world of the Sumerians was not a golden age. It was complex, hierarchical, and often harsh. But it was deeply human. Through their labor, rituals, meals, and stories, Sumerians crafted a daily life that was ordered yet mysterious, sacred yet practical. Their lives were fleeting, like ours, but lived with purpose and presence, in constant relationship with the land, the stars, and the gods. In the quiet corners of their homes and the bustling energy of their streets, the first great experiment in civilization took root. The great cities of Sumer, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Eridu were more than centers of culture and innovation. They were rivals, each fiercely proud of its patron deity, its lineage of kings, and its claim to divine favor. From the beginning, Sumerian civilization was a mosaic of independent city-states, bound together by shared language and religion, yet fractured by ambition and pride. As these cities grew in wealth and power, so too did their thirst for dominance, and it was through the crucible of war and diplomacy that kingship in Sumer evolved, from a temporary wartime role into a permanent sacred institution. Early on, the role of king, or lugal, meaning great man, was fluid, often granted by a council of elders during times of conflict. But over time, as conflicts became frequent and external threats loomed, the lugal became a fixture. He was not merely a military commander, but a judge, priest, builder, and representative of divine will. His authority was justified by myth. The gods had chosen his city to rule, and he was their earthly instrument. Temples and palaces began to grow in size and splendor, reinforcing his power. Kings commissioned hymns, monuments, and inscriptions to record their victories and establish a legacy that would echo through eternity. The history of Sumer is in many ways a history of its wars. City-states clashed over water rights, boundary lines, and honor. One of the most vivid episodes comes from the 25th century BCE, when Lagash and Umma waged a bloody generations-long war over a fertile stretch of land. The kings of Lagash carved their victories into stone, including the famous Stele of the Vultures, which depicts soldiers marching behind their king and vultures carrying away the heads of the slain. These conflicts were not just territorial, they were spiritual. Victory meant not only wealth, but proof that one's god was stronger, one's city more favored. But even as cities clashed and kings rose and fell, a new force stirred in the north, one that would ultimately shatter Sumer's independence and reshape Mesopotamia forever. Around 2334 BCE, a charismatic ruler named Sargon of Akkad emerged. Sargon was not a Sumerian by origin, but a Semitic-speaking outsider who had risen from humble beginnings. According to legend, he was placed in a basket and set adrift in a river, only to be rescued and raised by a gardener, a story that would later echo in other mythologies. Sargon was a military genius, and once he seized power in Akkad, he launched a campaign that would conquer all of Sumer and beyond. The Akkadian Empire was the world's first true empire, a unification of city-states under a centralized rule. Sargon's armies swept through Sumer with stunning speed and efficiency. Cities like Uruk and Ur, once proud and sovereign, were absorbed into a vast imperial machine. Sargon declared himself not only king of Akkad, but king of the four quarters of the world. Yet, instead of erasing Sumerian culture, he adopted and expanded it. Cuneiform writing was used to record both Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Sumerian gods continued to be worshipped, and the bureaucratic innovations of the Sumerians became the backbone of the empire. The Sumerians had lost their independence, but their influence now stretched farther than ever before. The Akkadian dynasty endured for nearly 2 centuries, but like all empires, it eventually faltered. Internal rebellions, climate stress, and the mysterious Gutian invasions from the Zagros Mountains destabilized the region. As Akkad crumbled, the city-states of Sumer seized the moment. A new Sumerian renaissance began, most notably under the rule of Ur-Nammu of Ur, who founded the third dynasty of Ur around 2112 BCE. This period, often referred to as the Neo-Sumerian era, was a final flowering of Sumerian power, culture, and literature. Ur-Nammu and his successors brought order, prosperity, and monumental construction. The Grand Ziggurat of Ur, one of the best-preserved structures of its kind, was built during this time. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi's laws, set forth one of the earliest known legal systems. This resurgence felt like a revival of divine order, a last assertion of Sumerian greatness before the twilight came. But the rebirth could not last. The region was vulnerable both politically and environmentally. Prolonged droughts, declining agricultural yields, and pressures from migrating peoples eroded the foundations of Neo-Sumerian stability. Around 2004 BCE, the city of Ur fell to the Elamites, marking the symbolic end of Sumer as a political entity. Other city-states lingered, but they would never again wield the same influence. Though Sumer collapsed as a civilization, its spirit endured. The Babylonians and Assyrians who followed inherited their gods, their myths, their language, and their administrative genius. In fact, for centuries after its fall, scribes continued to learn and copy the Sumerian language, not to speak it, but to preserve its prestige, like Latin in medieval Europe. The decline of Sumer was not a fall into darkness, but a transformation. Its cities may have been conquered, its kings dethroned, but its legacy spread like river water, soaking into every civilization that came after. The dream of order, of divine kingship, of law and literacy lived on, and through clay tablets and whispered myths, the voices of Sumer never truly fell silent. The Sumerians may have vanished as a political force, but their fingerprints remain etched into the very foundations of the modern world. They were the first to carve order out of chaos, to transform the wild unpredictability of nature into measured systems of time, law, and meaning. Long after their cities crumbled and their language faded from everyday speech, their legacy endured, not as ruins, but as living systems that continue to shape how we think, write, govern, and dream. Their most enduring gift is writing. Cuneiform, the original code of civilization. From simple marks tracking grain to the sweeping epic of Gilgamesh, The Sumerians taught humanity how to capture thought, preserve memory, and communicate across generations. Without writing, there would be no history, no contracts, no philosophy or literature. It was the Sumerians who opened that door, who gave voice to silence and permanence to breath. In science and mathematics, they laid the groundwork for calculation, astronomy, and geometry. They plotted constellations, tracked lunar cycles, divided time into 60-minute hours, and developed tables of multiplication and square roots. These weren't abstractions. They were tools for managing crops, mapping floods, predicting omens, and keeping the cosmos in balance. Their scientific approach was practical, sacred, and systematic. They saw no division between the observable and the divine. In religion, the Sumerians established a template that would echo through millennia. The very concept of gods ruling from on high, of temples rising toward the heavens, of divine judgment and sacred texts. These all find roots in the Sumerian imagination. Their pantheon, myths, and rituals laid the foundation for later Mesopotamian beliefs and filtered into the spiritual DNA of the world's major religions. Their gods became archetypes. Their stories became scriptures in new tongues. But perhaps the greatest Sumerian legacy is civilization itself. The idea that humans could live together in great cities, bound by law, protected by walls, guided by shared belief, and enriched by writing, trade, and invention. They were the first to dream that such a world was possible, and in doing so, they made it real. Every school, every city council, every calendar, every library is a whisper of Sumer. Though their voices are buried in clay, their ideas still speak, shaping a world they never lived to see, yet helped bring into being. Long before the pyramids rose, before the prophets spoke, before empires stretched across continents, there were the Sumerians, a people who looked at the wild, untamed world around them and dared to dream it into order. They didn't inherit civilization, they invented it. In the silence of the Mesopotamian plains, they built cities from mud, summoned gods from imagination, carved words into clay, and told stories that still echo in the deepest parts of the human spirit. They didn't just plant crops. They planted the seeds of what it means to be human. Their world was fragile, carved from floods and fire, yet what they created endured in the most enduring way possible. Not in monuments of stone, but in ideas. Ideas that would ripple through Babylon, through Assyria, through Rome and Jerusalem, and into the very fabric of modern life. They gave us time, writing, law, worship, science, poetry, and politics. They dreamed of the stars, questioned mortality, searched for immortality, and left behind not just answers, but questions, the same ones we still ask today. The Sumerians are not just a distant chapter in human history. They are its prologue. They remind us that every great leap begins with a vision, a whisper in the dark, a spark of curiosity. They were the first to build, the first to wonder, the first to seek meaning beyond survival. In their myths, we hear the earliest voice of humanity grappling with love, death, justice, and destiny. In their cities, we see the blueprint of society itself. In their fall, we recognize the cycles of time, and in their legacy, we find the roots of everything we've become. So as we stand in our own towering cities, surrounded by technology, lost in networks of speed and sound, we would do well to remember the Sumerians, the first dreamers. Not because they were perfect, but because they were brave enough to imagine something more. Their clay tablets may have hardened, but their vision remains soft and luminous. A reminder that civilization is not just built with tools, but with dreams. If this journey through the world's first civilization moved you, inspired you, or changed the way you see our shared human past, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes that the past is alive and waiting to be remembered.